Okay, now I've already mentioned a couple of times that this is a 2017 forum on provenance of Indigenous plant plantings, and that's because IFA has been around since the 1980s, 1986. We're 31 years old this year, and I was the original vice president, and I stood up on this very stage, as I recall, in about 1988 at a provenance forum. IFA was founded on the whole concept of provenance, more to do with plants than animals, and of course with Indigenous Flora and Fauna Association. But one of the main motivations for people coming together back in the 80s was that there had been this burgeoning idea that we don't just want to grow Australian natives like eucalypts from Western Australia, beautiful though they may be. There was something special about the plants that grow around us, and we wanted to restore the local landscape to the way it was. And to do that, you can't really go very far without coming up against the concept of provenance and where the heck you get the plant material from. And so we ran a forum like this one. I don't think we had this many people actually, but back in the 1980s. And the linchpin of that was Dr. Yvonne Fripp, a geneticist. And she did a wonderful job of explaining to us all the genetics at that time. And this was world-leading stuff at the time. The whole concept of provenance hadn't been invented until the 1980s here, although I should pay recognition to the Bayside Community Nursery, who'd been running an Indigenous nursery since 1976. That's now the oldest Indigenous nursery that I've been able to discover, and they had the concept of Indigenous provenance back then. But at any rate, so we've done this before, but things have changed. The concepts and the issues that come up are now more complicated, and particularly now that we have climate change, there's been an awful lot of work being done over the past decade or so on how we adapt to climate change. And maybe that requires us to change our ideas about local provenance and what we should be planting at a particular site when we want to conserve local flora, whatever that might mean. So we've had this history with the whole issue, and it's time to update it. And we wanted to find out what you people think about these issues. So I'm going to run you through the responses to the surveys. Now we've got 125 registrations roughly. Did we crack it to 130? Didn't quite make it to 130. It's a full house. So we're very pleased about that. Of those, about half, 60 people, have responded to the survey. We've also got quite a few others who have responded to the survey but aren't here today. I'm going to present you the results of the people in the audience today. Firstly, because we're the ones who are dealing with this, and we're probably the ones who, for the most part, care most deeply about it. So here are the responses to 60 from 60 respondents to our survey. And the first question I'll put up is where the heck we all come from and what our involvement is with Indigenous planting. And by far, and you can add multiple entries here. So we've got an exact 50% of people who responded who are involved with an Indigenous nursery, either as a volunteer or as a staff member or a seed collector or something like that. But nearly all of those people are also involved in some other way with Indigenous planting, such as the second largest category, which is as a member of a land care group or a friends group or something like that. Next largest, as you see there, is on-ground bushland management work, and that's something that's changed enormously since IFA began in the 1980s, when there was just this very start of the idea that people could have an actual career, or at least a job, in looking after Indigenous flora and fauna. A bush crew did not exist until the 1980s, but now we've got quite a few people here who are doing that. Now, I can tell you don't need to pay a lot of attention to that because most of the others actually fit into one of these other categories, except there is a teacher amongst us and one or two others that perhaps don't quite fit into the others. So I'm very glad to have a teacher here. In fact, perhaps rather than go through all the others, you can read those if you've got good enough eyesight. I'll go down towards the lower ones because I'm particularly keen to see that we have somebody who's got a job in procuring things, because part of the problem with getting Indigenous provenance plants or local provenance plants in the ground is that procurement policies in large organisations often don't fit in with Indigenous nurseries' needs for lead time to collect and propagate seeds, those sorts of things. There are 2 open space planners. That's wonderful. Because they play a very important role in deciding what and where Indigenous plants get planted. And there are a couple of people involved in on-ground land reclamation. So that gives you an idea of how, or all the sorts of fields that are represented here today. Now, do we have anything from VoxVote that's notable? Is anything coming through? Yeah. The system is working. Would you like a microphone? I can see that it's going to be worthwhile swapping backwards and forwards, so I'm going to pass the microphone over to our VoxVote Meister, Amanda. It takes a while before it actually responds. It will.
There we go. We can see one question was already answered, but then it had to get asked again, which was, can we turn the stage light off, please? So there's quite a few questions coming through today about how do we better plan to avoid bottlenecks and to correct the supply. How do we decide what local is in the provenance question? And how do we manage the risk using local seeds? So people have got a lot of really good questions coming through.
Absolutely. And fortunately, all of those things are in hand coming up shortly. So next, I already flicked over, hadn't I? This is the sort of spectrum of level of expertise. I think only one person said that they were expert. Lots of people said they were fair or good, a few limited, and it's wonderful to have some novices here. I think this day is going to be a wonderful introduction to the whole issue of provenance. As I remember when I came along back in the 1980s as a young man. I know you're thinking, how can he possibly have been alive in the 1980s? Now, the sources of information that people have used to form their ideas on provenance are these. No, I thought they were very interesting. Discussion with our peers is the most important thing, with over 80% of people saying that that was an important factor in deciding their views on these matters. The next largest, at 60-odd%, is our own observations. So a lot of it's about talking to other people and just what we see ourselves rather than being informed externally. However, we've got over 50% of people who responded who have actually done university training on this sort of stuff or related stuff. So we have quite a lot of the audience who must have had some formal training and qualifications in related things. Meetings like this one, and I know Linda Broadhurst has presented so many presentations like this, and Professor Hoffman as well. So they've obviously made a big impact on people. Newsletters like the Indigenous Flora and Fauna Association's own newsletter, Indigenous, and the Australasian Network for Plant Conservation. I think I've got that right, looking at Linda here. Scientific journals have influenced 40-odd%. Organisational policies are important for some people, nearly 40%. Then there's some guidelines and other little things further down. I'm surprised that online videos get such a small amount, because if you check out the AABR, Australian Association of Bushland Regenerators website, they have some videos featuring Linda Broadhurst, which are a wonderful resource, so I can recommend those if you haven't got onto that. So that's how we've been informed. I thought that was instructive. Now, next question that was asked was, how do you decide what is local? And this is responding in part to the question that somebody put up on VoxVote. Different people have got wildly different ideas about what's local, and that varies according to the purpose, no doubt. Looking through the large list There were quite a few people who said around 10 kilometres. In many cases, they would moderate that by saying depending on the environment and the species and things like that. But the span ranges from people who only collect on site. It might be somebody from a friends group who wants to plant things back in their reserve. They only collect from the reserve. Other people collect from 100 kilometres away. And still regard that as local provenance. And I know there are people who sell seeds of Australian native grasses who will tell you that because of breeding systems and so on, you can quite happily buy seeds of, say, weeping grass, Microlenus dipoides, that come from way up in New South Wales, and grow them locally in southern Victoria, and that won't create any problems. So there's a wide range of concepts about what constitutes local provenance, but I was pleased to see that many of the respondents said that they use biological attributes, such as whether a species is wind-pollinated or bird-pollinated or whatever, and the geographic attributes of the site, including things like soil type, climate, regional vegetation type and so on. And some people even use predicted climates of the future. So they're the sorts of things that people use to decide what is local. So that might influence the answers they give to the following questions. And these are the questions that we're going to spend detailed time on with the panel. But just to show you where these issues stand amongst the 60 respondents amongst us, here is an ordered list of how people responded to the question, in your activities, how important are the following reasons to use plants of local provenance in your Indigenous plantings? And the first three, it's pretty much a tie. And just looking at how these bars changed hour by hour over the last couple of days, it was sort of neck and neck. And if we were to have an extra day, I'm sure it would have changed slightly. So the top three, and possibly even the fourth one, are pretty much equal in people's minds as to their importance. And look how far over on the scale they are. On the left-hand side, we've got not important, slightly important, somewhat important, and quite important at 3. So you can't actually get to 3 unless everybody says it's quite important. But we did get close to that with conserving the local gene pool's contribution to biodiversity. So that was a really big deal. Another almost equal top is maintaining ecological relationships with other flora and fauna, things like making sure that the plants that we put in are compatible with our local insects and so on. The third one is avoiding ecological disruption. For example, putting in plants that are going to provide food resources for insects at the wrong time of year because we've chosen plant material from a different climatic zone or something like that. And the fourth one, conserving local character and identity. And I was surprised that one came up so high. It's way above the somewhat important. It's halfway at least between somewhat important and quite important on average. Now, you can get slightly different perspectives on these things if you look at the distribution of how many people said that it's not important for each of these questions, how many said it's slight, how many somewhat, how many quite, and I've got charts of all those, but we'd spend all day going through those, so I've just given you the average responses here, and those first 4 show that they are the most important issues, but there are some other ones that aren't all that far behind, such as avoiding outbreeding depression, where if you bring in plant material genes from somewhere else, it may be that it mucks up your local gene pool and makes your plants less well suited to the local climate. And we're going to have an introduction, a primer on inbreeding and outbreeding presently. Quite a few people said that they choose locally Indigenous plants in the expectation that you'll get better growth and survival of the plants if they're of local provenance. The idea that our local plants are adapted to our local conditions. Still above the somewhat important level is the issue of planting so that seeds can be collected from those planted plants rather than having to continually harvest from our already depleted wild sources of seeds and cuttings. then we drop down to something that's still towards the somewhat important, so that when a species is split by botanists into multiple new species, we know that we've got the right one. And we'll look at a few cases of that. And finally, down the bottom, not all that much above slight, which surprised me, is so uncertainties in identification won't cause problems. And we won't spend a lot of time on that because so people feel it's important. I think it's important because when I go around to Indigenous nurseries, I practically always, I think, find some misidentifications. And that doesn't matter so much as long as you're selling local plants, and it might have the wrong name, but it's at least a local plant. Most people don't seem to regard that as an issue. All right, now, so that's the reasons why people decide to choose local plants or local provenance plants opposed to local species from elsewhere. Now, using the same scale, I'm about to put up the slide for why you might want to choose plants that are not of local provenance. I'll flick back to the other one, just that's on the same scale. I was quite interested to see that there's a high importance placed on all these things for growing local provenance and a very much lower overall importance placed on why you would want to grow plants that are not of local provenance. Now I'm going to flip over to VoxVote shortly, but I'm going to go through this lot and then we'll see where we get to from there. Okay, the top reason why one might choose plants that are not of local provenance when you're growing Indigenous plants is to avoid inbreeding. There are many cases, particularly in urban remnants, where we've got so few plants of a particular species left that you need to increase the population and maybe bring in some extra genes. And so that's the number one rated reason, and it doesn't quite make the somewhat important. Then there's a bit of a drop down to the reason of restoring a more natural level of genetic flow across the landscape. It's responding to fragmentation, whereas prior to European colonisation of the landscape, we had continuity of habitat, and so pollinators and so on, seeds, were able to more freely flow across the landscape and share genes. With our fragmented landscape, that doesn't happen, and so we've got this as the second most important reason for injecting new genes into our Indigenous plantings. Then the next one is avoiding excessive harvesting from local wild populations of plants. Then overcoming shortage of supply. I thought that one might be a bigger one because so often, and in fact, in almost every project that I've been involved in where local provenance plants are called from, there's been an amendment to it because you can't get that species. Sometimes substitutions are made, but sometimes you just have to accept something that isn't so local. Moving down the scale, we've got assisting genetic adaptation to changes other than climate change, and that one comes out just a shade ahead of assisting genetic adaptation to climate change. On a statistical basis, you'd say they are equal. So people are considering or choosing plants that are not of local provenance in order to help the plantings cope with climate change, or it might be salinity. If you've got salinisation, then you don't really want to plant plants that can't cope with it, so you might choose something from nearby that can cope with that. Then to meet time requirements for grants and that sort of thing, we're down to the only slight level, better survival and growth than local. Of which there is some evidence, and I'll show you some of that later too. And finally, the cost, which is a non-issue, is down near the not important. So they're the responses that people gave. Thank you very much for that. I think it provides a really useful background to what matters to people, don't you think? All right, now, I'm going to bring the panel up in a moment, but first let's have a look at VoxVote. We're going to talk about all of those issues in detail next with the panel, but Amanda, what's happening on VoxVote?
I feel like we're in a game show. It's quite exciting.
You can be my beautiful assistant.
I feel like I need to do this. I guess one of the questions that seems to be popping up is, you know, are we at risk of losing species if we still remain very concentrated on local provenance? I think that's coming through with a number of the questions. And, you know, what should the ratio be around local, regional? Some questions about that. And how do we mimic natural migration in these kind of fragmented landscapes, which might have had natural regeneration? So,
excellent. They're all things that relate to the issues that we're now about to discuss in detail. Can I invite the members of the panel up onto the stage, please? I've already introduced them, and you can see their affiliations there.